and begin. We'll give it a moment or two to let folks log in. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Edward Hirsch presenting his new anthology, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart. He'll be joined by fellow poets Victoria Chang and Vijay Seshadri, so you're in for an excellent evening. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Edward, Victoria, Vijay, and the team at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. A couple little housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. There's a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered, please post that question in the Q&A. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions just from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase this and many other books on site. I think we actually have some great Poetry Month displays up right now, so you might want to stop by. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for quick pickup in the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat in a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of poets and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Now I'll quickly introduce our distinguished guest this evening. Victoria Chang's poetry books include Barbie Chang, The Boss, Salvinia Molesta, Circle, and most recently, Obit. Her children's books include Is Mommy, illustrated by Marla Frazee, and Love, Love, a middle grade novel. She lives in Los Angeles, though she's calling in from Morro Bay this evening, and serves as the program chair of Antioch's low residency MFA program. Vijay Seshadri is the author of the poetry books Wild Kingdom, The Long Meadow, Three Sections, and most recently, That Was Now, This Is Then, as well as many essays, reviews, and memoir fragments. His work has been widely published and anthologized and recognized with a number of honors, among them the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Edward Hirsch has published 10 books of poetry and 6 books of prose, among them How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, a national bestseller. He's received numerous awards, including the National Book Critics Circle Award and a MacArthur Fellowship. A longtime professor, Hirsch is now president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and he lives in Brooklyn, New York. In his new collection, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, Hirsch selects poems from the 19th century to the present, including works by Chang and Seshadri, and illuminates them, unpacking context and references to help the reader fully experience the range of emotion and wisdom within these poems. It's a collection to comfort and enthrall anyone experiencing grief or loneliness that celebrates the power of poetry to enrich our lives, even through heartbreak. So Edward will start things off with an introduction of the book, and you'll hear some poetry and conversation from all three authors, and they'll answer your questions after that. So please join me in welcoming, to start things off, Edward Hirsch.
Thank you, Jessica. Very glad to be with you. Greenlight is my local bookstore in Brooklyn, so I'm glad to see everyone, virtually speaking. And I'm very glad to be joined by Victoria and Vijay, who are two of my favorite poets and also friends, to talk about poetry. And I thought I'd say something about the book, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, and then read a poem, and then ask Victoria to read her poem that's in the collection and talk about it, and then Vijay to read his poem in the collection and talk about that, and we'll go from there. The premise of my book is that everyone suffers, everyone has heartbreak. American culture is extremely immature, not really capable, not really eager or willing to deal with these heartbreaks. As soon as something terrible happens to people, American culture immediately starts telling people to start healing. It's not that I'm against healing, but I don't think you can heal before you can mourn, and that you can't forget the heartbreak, and that the heartbreak is one of the things that makes us human and that no one escapes. And the culture's way of trying to medicate sorrow away or divide it into recognizable stages and get rid of it is a way to dismiss grief and ask people to move on very quickly. And as a result, people almost always begin to stop talking about what happened to them and keep it to themselves as if it's some kind of shameful secret. Poets have another way of dealing with this. They take their griefs or their sorrows and they try to transform them into the faithful nuances of art. They try to make something out of it. So while I was working on this book and picking poems that have meant something to me, that have been meaningful to me, some of them for much of my life, others more recently, some of them by people I know, others by people I do not know. I kept in mind a line from Stanley Kunitz, in a murderous time, the heart breaks and breaks and lives by breaking. And also a line by Cheloswell Miłosz in a poem of his, a marvelous poem, it's not in my book, called Elegy for NN. He says, and the heart does not die when one thinks it should. So we live with these sorrows, we carry them along with us, we try to figure out how to deal with them. In my book, I write about 100 poems that have been, that are of great sorrow, and I try to write about them in two ways. I try to write about them as made things, as poems, as structures. They're not diary entries. They're something that's been created, that engages a form, that thinks through a poetic problem. At the same time, unlike most literary criticism, I try to remember that these are all human documents, that these people are not just playing games, they're writing about things that are meaningful to them, that have significance. And I try to keep the human story present while writing about the poem technically. For example, my book begins with a poem by Wordsworth called Surprised by Joy. In this poem, which is a Petrarchan sonnet, Wordsworth is walking along and he sees something marvelous in the city in London. And he turns to exclaim to his companion to tell her how much he loves seeing it. But it turns out she's not there. In fact, it's his daughter and he's forgotten that she has died. And then he's completely overwhelmed by grief as he realized that he had forgotten that his daughter had died. And thus Wordsworth's great poem of joy is also a great poem of sorrow. And it's a poem of agon for him, for having lost a child, but it's also a beautifully made Petrarchan sonnet. And this is my premise, that you can make a poem, that poets make poems so that they last, so that they find readers. One thing I should say is that this sometimes comes up because some of my poems that I'm choosing are depressive or sorrowful. Many of them are unhappy. And people are sometimes puzzled why these poems don't make me unhappy, why in fact they console me. And that's because I believe at the heart of the poetry project is an idea of companionship. The poems somehow companion us, that they're made in solitude and they find solitary readers. And that the very premise of a poem as a made thing suggests that there's a reader on the horizon. One of the poems I write about is by John Clare, who's a marvelous rural poet from England, and he's writing from an institution in the 1830s. And his poem is called I Am, and it begins, I am, yet what I am none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. Now in this poem, John Clare states that he consumes his own woes. But the fact that he mesmerizes the rhythm and the fact that he makes this thing rhyme suggests that he's making it for some reader. Now, maybe there's not the readers in the mental hospital where he was detained. Maybe they're not the readers who would read the poem in the Bedford News, and I think it came out in 1848 in rural England. Maybe there's some future reader. But it does suggest that there will be some companionship, that someone will understand, that there will be a connection, that a poem is a message in a bottle that can find a reader. And when we pick up that message in the bottle and open it, then we become the readers, we become the recipients. we become the place where one heart speaks to another. And for this reason, poems that are very lonely or isolated don't feel isolated or lonely to me. They feel recognizable, and I feel companioned by them. And I feel that they open up a space in me that I might not have been able to name myself. They recognize something in me that I could not articulate. And trying to unpack and figure out how these poems work has been for me a great solace and consolation. So I'm eager to get going on some of the poems. And I just thought to get us started, I'd read a poem by Stanley Kunitz called Halley's Comet, which is, I think, an extraordinary poem. The thing, I guess, to say about it, just to start, is that Stanley Kunitz was an old man when he wrote this poem, but he's remembering an event, Halley's Comet, that was supposed to strike when he was in first grade. So he's catapulting himself back. Miss Murphy in first grade wrote its name in chalk across the board and told us it was roaring down the storm tracks of the Milky Way at frightful speed. And if it wandered off its course and smashed into the earth, there'd be no school tomorrow. A red-bearded preacher from the hills with a wild look in his eyes stood in the public square at the playground's edge, proclaiming he was sent by God to save every one of us, even the little children. Repent, ye sinners, he shouted, waving his hand-lettered sign. At supper, I felt sad to think that it was probably the last meal I'd share with my mother and my sisters. But I felt excited too, and scarcely touched my plate. So mother scolded me and sent me early to my room. The whole family's asleep except for me. They never heard me steal into the stairwell hall and climb the ladder to the fresh night air. Look for me, Father, on the roof of the red brick building at the foot of Green Street. That's where we live, you know, on the top floor. I'm the boy in the white flannel gown, sprawled on this coarse gravel bed, searching the starry sky, waiting for the world to end. Well, I just think that's a marvelous poem. And one of the things you can see is the way that Kunitz catapults himself back into his childhood is he takes on the language of a child too. Elizabeth Bishop does something very similar in her poem In the Waiting Room, which is a kind of older sister to this poem. They're both use a kind of short 3-beat line. If you remember in that poem, she's in the dentist waiting room and she says, she's looking at the National Geographic and she says, parenthetically, I could read. That's the sort of thing that a 7-year-old would say. And this is what's happening here. It's the perspective of an old man, but throwing himself back into the language of a 5-year-old. And you notice in the poem that it's in the past tense. Miss Murphy in first grade wrote its name in chalk, but 2/3 of the way through the poem, it changes to the present tense. He goes, the whole family's asleep except for me. And then there's a kind of, I don't know, I find very moving magical thinking here, which is that, of course, his father's not there, his father's not alive anymore, but he's calling out to him and his father, they've moved. So his father doesn't know where they're living now. So he has to tell him that, oh, we're here on Green Street at this new address so you can see us. And his father won't recognize him. And so he identifies himself. There's another poem by Kunitz called The Portrait, in which he talks about going up to the attic and seeing a portrait of someone he doesn't know. And he brings it down, a thin-lipped stranger, and he gives it to his mother. And she takes his photograph and she rips it up and she slaps him in the face. And he says, at 64, I can feel my cheeks still burning. His father committed suicide before he was born, and he never knew him, but he never gave up longing for him. And because it was forbidden to speak about, even in his house, he had to keep it a secret. And here, he calls out to his father, and he tells his father, here I am, look for me on the roof. And then you get this, to me, indelible image, unforgettable image to me I'm the boy in the white flannel gown, sprawled on this coarse gravel bed, searching the starry sky, waiting for the world to end. It's just a moment frozen in time. And the longing for the father is frozen in time too. As the world, something about the world coming to an end, supposedly coming to an end, of course it didn't, about Halley's Comet striking and ending the world, opened up this space for him of feeling that he could not forget, and that he then created as an old man, or recreated as an old man, in this comet-like poem. So this is the method. This is my way of operating, to try and think through the poem as a made thing, its rhythm, its imagery, its character, its metaphor, but also as keeping in mind Stanley Kunitz as an old man and Stanley Kunitz as a boy, living in these two worlds, calling out for his father in a way that is, to me, indelible and unforgettable. So I try to do that 100 times. And I can't say it was easy, but it was meaningful to me. And it took me a lot of time with each one, because what people are writing about is serious, it's sorrowful, it's meaningful. And I want to respect the human being who made this work. One of the more recent poems that really stunned me was Victoria's poem, Obit, the Blue Dress, that later found its way into a book. But at the time when I first read it, it wasn't in a book. It was by itself. And I was tremendously moved by it. And I thought, Victoria, if you'd be willing to, maybe you could read it for us now.
Sure. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. This poem is called The Blue Dress. The blue dress died on August 6, 2015, along with the little blue flowers, all silent. Once the petals looked up, now small pieces of dust. I wonder whether they burned the dress or just the body. I wonder who lifted her up into the fire. I wonder if her hair brushed his cheek before it grew into a bonfire. I wonder what sound the body made as it burned. They dyed her hair for the funeral, too black. She looked like a comic character. I waited for the next comic panel to see the speech bubble and what she might say, but her words never came, and we were left with the stillness of blown glass, the irreversibility of rain, and millions of little blue flowers. Imagination is having to live in a dead person's future. Grief is wearing a dead person's dress forever.
What a knockout poem. I wonder if you'd say something, because it's a kind of pattern poem. I wondered if you'd say something about the form for people who can't see it.
Sure, yeah. So my mother passed away in 2015 of pulmonary fibrosis, and that's when your lungs harden gradually and you suffocate to death. And I was trying really hard to avoid writing a traditional elegy for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one of which was everyone else I feel like has done it way better than I could ever. But because of her illness, you know, she was sick for a long time, and little things were lost constantly. And so I don't know when I thought of this sort of obituary form, but they look like this. So on the page look like little newspaper obituaries. And in each one, everything sort of dies. So empathy, sadness, yesterday, the doctors, me, time, and this one, the blue dress. So that's kind of how the form came to be. But I don't think initially they were like that. They were just written on a notebook with little things dying. And eventually, by the time they made it on the computer, they started to take more of a vertical shape.
There must have been something, I mean, even though the subject is so sad, there must have been something that was a little joyful for you about the oddity of an obituary is so nondescript. They're so bland, really. And the sort of stuff that's in your poem would never be in a newspaper obituary. I mean, there's sort of a kind of weird, to me, a kind of exuberance or gleefulness or joy in the weirdness of the bland obituary format, and then what's actually inside your poem.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the obituary form itself is really comical, and I read them for fun on my own anyway. And so just the flatness of the diction, the kind of, the formulaic, so and so died on this date, and that all interested me, and it seemed appropriate to as sort of this frame or boundary to explore my own grief, which was much different. And so but yeah, I mean, people tell me when they read this book that some parts of it made them laugh. And I do think I think making anything even out of deep sadness is gleeful as as someone that likes to make things. And so I enjoyed the process a lot, even though at moments I remember feeling really sad, but then other times just the joy of being able to create something out of this, these feelings, and testing myself to see, it's like, could I, articulate this grief to someone else sitting in front of me, and using language is the only thing that I really have. So that was the challenge. Is it possible even to explain how awful, one might feel? And I think ultimately, I think language doesn't quite get there, but if you can get like an inch away or 6 inches away, or it varies obviously with every line or every word, that is the joy of writing, and that's the joy of creation, and I think the solace of making something during these.
There is a weird metonymic displacement in the poem. Like you go obituary, obit, the blue dress died. You expect to say an obituary, go, my mother died, or so and so died. A person, you don't go, the blue dress died. That must have been weird for you, and I think somewhat playful, but also a bit shattering.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's fun. I mean, I think that's the imagination. It can do whatever it wants and go wherever it wants. And I think that for me at least as a writer, if you just let it go where it goes, I think that's the fun of it. It's writing is supposed to be fun. I think play for me more than anything else. So
there's also
I enjoyed
this
it. Yeah.
Weird surreal moment that I know I've had it. I think many of us have had it. It's almost comical, but really it's not comical. Where you look at a person who's died that you love, and they don't quite look like themselves. And this is, at first it's funny, but it's also a bit shattering and extremely unsettling. And there's a moment where you come up with almost like a cartoon with about, I think it has to do with her hair, the color of her hair.
Right. Yeah, and they're, they feel like plastic. You're not supposed to, I don't know if you're supposed to touch them, but I touched my mother's hand, and it felt so like, just like a made thing. Like, it was so bizarre, and she looked so bizarre and funny. And they put the makeup on all wrong, and, the hair that was the wrong color. And we just picked up whatever dye at the local CVS and gave it to them, and it was wrong. Obviously it was way too black, and everything looked ridiculous. But it was entirely, it's like a tragic comedy. It was pathos, right, at its very best, I guess. And so, and it's odd too when you go to an event like that. You see people you haven't seen in a long time, and they're like, "Hi, how are you?" It's like mundane sort of chatty conversation. You're laughing, and right behind you is your dead mother lying there like a cartoon character. And so the whole thing is just really odd, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I was trying to capture some of that oddity of this ritual called the funeral.
And also some of the I'd say dislocation and disorientation of a moment out of time when someone you love is being taken away from you, and you think your mind fixates on details. Like, I mean, there's a kind of obsessive moment where you start thinking here about the dress, even though really you should be thinking about your mother.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's true. And I think memory is also strange too, and the kinds of things you remember from an experience that doesn't even seem real when you think about it. You're just in this really intense, foggy moment, and you're expected to perform, you know, in front of all these people, a certain kind of professionalism and stoicism, you know, and yet when you remember back on it, because you're performing so hard, all the details are just small things, you know, like little things, and it's just very cloudy. But yeah, I think this was one of the only poems that I wrote in the book that I didn't really revise very much. And so I think the other poems I spent a lot more time revising them. And I think this one came more quickly.
I like the impromptu associative quality of this poem inside of a somewhat strict format that makes it look like newspaper print, a column in a paper. And I just think that the poem, no one has ever done that I've seen before, create within this sort of rectangle or square form something so wild and vivid, and really does something remarkable in honor of your mother, but also in honor of your feeling for your mother. So thank you so much for this poem.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So Vijay, would you be willing to read your poem Aphasia and say something about it? You're still on mute. You're on mute.
I know. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thanks.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Aphasia. His signs flick off. His names of birds and his beautiful words. Eleemosynary, fur, cinerarium, reckless. Skip like pearls from a snap necklace. Scattering again. His thinking venture out of his mouth. His grammar head south. Pathetic his subjunctives, just as pathetic his mangling the emphatic Enclitic he once was the master of. Still, all in all, he has his inner weather of pure meaning, though the wind is keening through his Alps and his clouds hang low, and the forecast is rain mixed with snow, heavy at times.
It's very mournful, but also very linguistic.
Yeah.
Tell-
I mean, I was interested in what you and Victoria were talking about with respect to her, the Obit form and the rectangle, you know, and I think it was Creeley who said that strong feelings require strong containers, you know, in some sense. And yeah. And I think that's to the extent, you know, when you talked about the poem in the book, I think that's something you really lighted on. But, you know,
Tell us about the form. You made up a form for it.
Yeah, I think those forms are generated by a certain sort of looseness in the initial impulse to rhyme. That is that the rhymes as they come determine the pattern, you know, in that poem. And then I just replicated them. So it's kind of, you know, as I remember, it's, the rhyming is A, B, B, C, C, D.
Right, the
And
first
that
and the
goes
last
all the
lines
way
don't
through.
rhyme. Yeah.
Yeah, the first and the last lines don't rhyme. And, you know, and I think that the formal issue there is always with rhyming, especially in the modern world, in the post-rhyming, you know, versifying world, which is the one I've always lived in, you know. When you rhyme, what becomes more important than anything else is not the cultural convention that's accepted, but the issue of making rhyme inevitable. And one of the ways you make rhyme inevitable is you kind of shift the patterns from what the reader expects. Unlike the Wordsworth poem, everybody who was reading that Wordsworth poem when it was published knew exactly what a Petrarchan sonnet was, a Miltonic sonnet. And, and kind of our world, you sort of have to change the terms of the reader's engagement with form, and conceptualize it to a certain extent. So I think that was the pattern of the rhyming, and that's
were you worried that you would feel this? I mean, there's a place where you go, it's pretty strong, and I wondered if you felt disloyal by going pathetic his subjunctives, just as pathetic his mangling the emphatic and clitic he once was the master of. First of all, not everyone will know what an emphatic and clitic is. So as a linguistic term, why don't you tell us something about that?
Yeah. Yeah, an emphatic and clitic, you don't really, I can't think of, like, for example, in idiomatic language, the way the Canadians will drop in a hey, to emphasize certain parts of speech. Now, it's much more common in other languages, especially like Eastern Indo-European languages like Persian and Urdu and Hindi. There's a very, very clearly defined particle that doesn't mean anything. It just emphasizes a part of speech that would otherwise not be emphasized. So it has a kind of musical quality, and it has a semantic quality, but it's not something that, it's not a particle that itself means something, And the one I was thinking of was the Urdu particle he. Hi is the way you would transliterate it. And it's kind of very, very important in Urdu poetry. It's sort of, and generally in idiomatic poetry across the Gangetic Plain. And I was thinking about it in particular with the person who is the basis of who's the kind of the occasion, the donné of the poem, which was a friend of mine who taught me Hindi. And he was American, and he had been, and he was a scholar of he had a PhD in English from Columbia and English literature, and but he was also a fantastic linguist. And early in his academic career, after he'd gotten a job in the late 50s, he went to India and fell in love with it. And he picked up 5 or 6 of the languages. And he used to teach Hindi as an adjunct at Columbia. And he was just this extraordinary guy. In terms of like the issue of betrayal, he isn't the person in the poem. His condition in the ground when he was 80, and he taught me many other things. He taught me all about opera. He was a really good friend of mine, and when he was 80, he experienced some minor strokes. So he had, he started experiencing aphasia, and it just struck me as like tragic irony that a person with such extraordinary linguistic gifts. I mean, so the kind of person who's fluent in 12 languages, it's just that kind of thing, would be experiencing this neurological.
Not American.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Oh, he was American. He was from Connecticut. And, his father was Jewish and his mother was French Canadian. And so anyway, he. So, I mean, while I felt incredible sympathy and compassion for him, I didn't quite know how to get in all the feelings I had about that, And one of those feelings really had to do with that sense of irony I felt. And, and also, I think the poem, what you might have been picking up on, Ed, was, there's an anger coursing through all the poem, right? The anger about the condition of human beings who suddenly have to suffer this, and in some sense, that is transposed onto this character who is a fictional character, but based on, an actual person initially, or suggested by an actual person, and a lot of the elements of that character, of course, those words are words that I love. It wasn't necessarily they weren't necessarily words that my friend loved. I didn't know what his favorite words were. And yeah.
But I think that's part of the projection of the poem, that you project yourself into the condition of someone who the irony is so bitter. The irony is so dark. I mean, someone who has just tremendous linguistic skills, which after all, you want to have as a poet, as someone who, who traffics in language, who then finds himself unable to use language, and that as a semiotic sign. I mean, his signs flick off right from the beginning. And I think that's part of what gives the poem its intensity, is your projection of the words you love and yourself into the situation.
No. I mean, I don't know what the transmutation is, but I know there's always a tremendous transmutation of grief and sorrow when you write a poem. And I don't really know, it's interesting, the issue of betrayal in some way, because there's always terrible grief and loss. The feeling of loss is a part of grief, right? But sort of, a certain undeniable anger is a part of grief too. I mean, I think, I don't know if either of you feel this or have felt it, but, when my parents died, I was just devastated at losing them. But, there was always this element in me that sort of felt that, wow, you've been such a problem to me all your lives, and now you're done. I was like, come on,
Yeah, it's unacceptable.
I can't believe it. It's just like, it's just unacceptable. You had so much to thrash out with them too, right?
Yeah, there's a poem in the book by William Meredith called Parents, which is related to what you're saying. At the end, he goes, "Father, mother, we cry to our uncomprehending children and grandchildren."
Yeah, that's a great line.
Go on fighting with them, you go on arguing with them, you go on talking to them. They shaped you so much, you can't believe it comes down to this in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really
anyway,
funny.
I think it's a marvelous occasion for the poem that you took, the nonce form, which means for the occasion. You invented a form here that was able to enact what you were experiencing. And one of the things I thought about both your poems is that there is an element in your own poem, in the writing of it, where you actually, it's not all worked out in advance. You're actually listening to what you're writing and then in some way responding to what you've heard. And that's how I took your last stanza, Vijay, where you come up on his inner weather of pure meaning, and then you go from that to through his Alps, and you sort of take the idea of inner weather and make it somewhat literal. Mm-hmm. It's like you're listening to your own language and then driving it through. And I thought Victoria was doing that with the imagery of the blue dress and the flowers on the blue dress. Mm-hmm. And the imagery starts to take on a life of its own as you work through the sort of development of it.
Mm-hmm.
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 Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah.
And do you remember writing? Do you remember? So when Vijay was talking, I was curious. So it sounds like when you were writing this poem, starting at maybe, so when you wrote his signs flick off, his names of birds, and his beautiful, like when you're writing, then you are thinking, you're just letting it kind of go. So you felt like, okay, this should rhyme, or I feel like the rhyming should happen, and you just start rhyming, and then the reckless with the necklace, like, are you creating it literally as you go, and then you decide that the linoleum, the last line in the first stanza, is not going to rhyme with anything else? Like, is that how you make your poem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first stanza, that pattern was improvised, right? And it was his names of birds and his beautiful words, because I had to get to the words. And this is all of course, very, it's not something you're doing consciously. You're just following a certain rhythm and a kind of, and, you know, and then you start emerging because the thematic element takes hold, you know, and words, and then there's just a simple expansion of that. And then I guess it's the serendipity of the rhyme of reckless and necklace, which was the rhyme I really liked, you know, and I think that is kind of a nice rhyme. And I've always liked the word reckless, if you look at it. I don't know if either of you feel this, or I mean, I'm sure you actually both do, like, especially when I was a kid, I would look at a word on a page and get completely lost in it, you know, and it would cease to have significance or meaning. It would just be this form in type, you know, and it would suddenly become abstract. And I remember that really vividly from when I was a kid, but it's pretty much lasted all my life. I mean, I could do that now. I could pick up a newspaper and look at a word and just, the physical shape on the page would free itself from the meaning of the word and just sort of linger above it in some way. And reckless and fur are both words like that for me, you know, and they're kind of, and fur is even a word I use when I teach poetry workshops. I write it on the blackboard and I say, this word is so beautiful. You think it should be F-U-R, but it's F-I-R. And then you go, that's so weird, you know, that it's F-I-R rather than F-U-R, and how strange is that? And that shows you how strange the world really is in some way, in this minute way. So I think, you know, all of that was happening, and then the pattern just sets, right? And then that becomes the principle by which the other stanzas are made, that sort of thing that is now cooled down so you can see its shape. And so yeah, so it is a nonce stanza. Kind of.
I think Vijay's internet is kind of, your internet is yours,
you know,
it's a little spotty, right? Yeah, okay. I didn't know if it was me or
No,
Vijay's.
it's a bit spotty.
Is my internet gone? Yeah.
It's
a
just,
little spotty.
You sort of come in and out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica, I wonder if you want to bring in the audience a little bit, if you have any questions for us.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you so much for this conversation. We do have a couple of folks with some questions here. Susan asks, and the beginning of her question is a quotation, "If language doesn't get there," end quote, "what does take you all the way to understanding and living with your grief, or does that never happen?" So I guess this could be for all of you.
I don't know if there's an answer to that question. I don't think that anything ever entirely gets you there, but some people find themselves closer through music. Some people find themselves closer through art. Some people find themselves closer through memory. I think that you're looking for articulations of feeling that can be inchoate. And for me, poetry gets closer than other things. But it doesn't exactly, language does have its limits, and there is always a bit of a gap. And in my opinion, much as I love poetry, and much as I believe that poetry speaks to our inner lives better than anything else, it doesn't give you the person who died back. We don't, you know, the losses are losses, and there are compensations in consciousness and in art, and I believe in them. but I don't believe that they will give you back the person who died, and that it would be false to say that it would. But what it can give you is some language for your feeling. And I don't know if you, Vijay, and Victoria feel the same way about it. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think what you said is true. I mean, I always use the word slippage to describe the distance between language and emotion or feeling. And I think it goes back to, for me at least, to what Ed, you had talked about early on, which is, a poem is made in solitude, but it's also, there's a companion to it. So I think I'd like to think that through reading, and I've experienced this with my book, people will write me and say that they felt that the book was a companion to them during their own grieving and their own feelings. And I think that's how we get to it, is through this kind of collectiveness that we do feel. I mean, grief is very solitary. So, like I always say, it's kind of asynchronous, right? So something you might experience now someone else sitting next to you just might not feel those things. It's not their mother or their daughter or whoever. But I think ultimately reading is a way to bridge that gap and to close that gap of asynchronicity for me. And because you could pick up something that someone else wrote and suddenly feel that kind of companionship and that collective grief that you would never be able to feel elsewhere. I just think it's hard to, someone else probably at this moment is feeling really bad, but I don't feel really bad right now. And so if there, how do we connect when we're all feeling different things at different seconds of the day? But I think reading, to me, that is the greatest companion. And so that's how I kind of lived through my grieving. I read a lot of books. I read Ed's book. I read Megan O'Rourke's nonfiction book. I read Joan Didion. I read Grief Observed. I read everything I could find. Mary Jo Bang's book, Elegy, anything. I went back to read some Whitman, so I think that to me is how I worked through, if that makes sense. Maybe just kind of walked through some of the difficult times is reading. And then also going back to what Ed was saying too, it's like, I think we live in a fix-it culture. There's nothing to fix. And just accepting that it is what it is, and you just you live inside of it, grief, and that's okay too. So understanding that I'm not trying to change anything is part of, for me, the process of grieving too.
Vijay?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I could say two things. That on the one hand, I had the experience with the book I just published, which has, 3 elegies in its middle section, that reviewers, a couple of reviewers said that the book made them feel less lonely. And I think that is something that is a function of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
That if you can kind of authenticate your emotions to yourself, then you have arrived at a kind of intersubjectivity with other people. And that therefore, they can find freedom not through the language itself, but the way in which the language can connect them to a feeling that they had, that you also had, and that is universal. And that, I think, is a sort of important social function. I think the other part of that question that has to do with the resolution of grief also has to do with this poetry in some way too, that poetry is also, it's kind of an asymptotic art, in the sense that it's always getting closer and closer and closer to truth, but never quite touching it, Mm-hmm. But, I mean, if you are a poet and you're reading poetry, then you're always feeling that closeness to the truth. And, and the whole idea, I mean, of course, Whitman It's always saying, well, there is no such thing as death, right? There isn't, and that whole idea of all of this loss that we feel and all of the grief that we feel being resolved somehow, I mean, either in a simple way or a complicated way, in some sort of way in which we understand something about the universe itself that allows us to reconcile ourselves to it, I mean, that's something I think poetry holds out. It might never deliver it, but certainly that's the great kind of, it's the great longing of language. It's kind of, and, so I kind of feel that, yeah, I mean, not that I'm making any claims about the universe or about, what actually all of this stuff means, but I think when we're kind of making meaning of the sort that we make when we make art, we're always reaching towards something that will in fact resolve these things for us. And we might never arrive there, and we might fall back into our own depression and our unhappiness and our grief and our sense of being alone and stuff, but that's what we're doing, I think. I mean, am I saying,
yeah,
am I kind of going over the top here? I don't want to,
you're making sense.
scare anybody.
Jessica?
I wonder if you'd mind if I ask a question. This has been on my mind since the beginning of this conversation, but all three of the poems that you've focused on this evening are so personal, are about the loss of a loved one or about a very personal moment. I wonder if you could talk about poems of grief that are about, big events, about war, or I'm thinking about this year when we've all been going through a sort of collective grief. And if those are the kinds of poems that are included in the book, and what the potential of poetry is to help us understand as a civilization, even as a community, how to process those kinds of grief as well as the very intimate personal ones, or if there's a difference.
I'd say there's a kind of line that goes from the personal to these larger questions, which are also personal. There are a whole range of griefs and sorrows, and I think they're a little easier to talk about these personal ones, which is where we've started. But for example, there's a devastating poem by Lucille Clifton called Jasper, Texas, 1998, which is about well, it's a lynching, but it's about Jay Bird and how he was dragged and murdered in the street. It's not, and in this poem by Lucille Clifton, which is wrenching to read, she projects herself into the severed head of Jay Bird and speaks from Jay Bird's dead body's point of view. And Langston Hughes does something else in Song for a Girl, which is also a lynching poem. There's a tremendous poem by a Yiddish poet named Kadya Molodovsky called Merciful God that she wrote right after in 1946 as she found out about the Holocaust. And it's got a funny joke in it, a sort of what my family, they used to call kidding on the square, about Jews as a chosen people. And she goes, merciful God, choose someone else for a change. And the whole poem is like, choose someone else. I don't want to be, don't choose us anymore. There's a poem by extraordinary poet named Miklos Radnati, a Hungarian poet, which is an elegy for a friend of his, but it's not really an elegy. It's sort of an elegy. What I mean by that is it's a partial elegy because his friend is missing. And he gets news from the front that his friend is missing and he doesn't know where he is. And in some ways, he knows that his friend has died, but in another way, he can't accept that his friend has died. And he's in this sort of space that I think Victoria was talking about of not having the closure of an elegy. And the poem is called Fragment, and it enacts a kind of fragmentary. There's a poem by Joy Harjo, and in fact, my piece about Joy Harjo begins with her reminder to me that there's also the grief for the loss of a people. And also a grief for a larger genocide, which I think is what you're referring to also. This is for someone named Aname Maku, who was an AIM activist, a Native American woman that she sort of knew but didn't really know, who was murdered. And it's about the murder and Joy's inability to accept that this person has been murdered, who represents Indian rights. She's not a personal friend. And so in this sense, it's referring to, I think, what you're talking to, which is a kind of public grief. And so, I mean, all these poems, in my opinion, are personal, but the griefs that people write about are of all different sorts. And some of them have to do with a kind of what you're talking about, a kind of national mourning about various larger sorrows in the society. But I believe that even these more politically oriented poems or politically oriented sorrows speak most strikingly when they're also personal, when the poet has a deep stake in what he or she is writing about, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to ask, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask Victoria and Vijay one last question, and connected to what we were talking about just before we began the webinar about what you think Edward is doing with this collection, and what he's accomplished, or what it meant to you to be a part of this anthology, how that was for you. Victoria, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. No, I was as I was saying before we started that I've been reading Ed's books for so long, and I think what Ed does so well, and no one else, I don't think, and we were talking about this before this, I don't think anyone else is doing the work that he's doing, is that he's really challenging every reader. So you don't have to be a poet, to read his books. But poets can also get a lot out of them. I don't know if people even know this, but there's a ton of prose writing in each of these poems. It's not just an anthology of 100 poems, to break your heart, but there's actually a ton of writing about each poem, after each poem. And I think it's not just sort of like, oh, I really love this poem, it's a great poem, and then you're done. But it actually goes into a lot of elements of how a poet may read these poems. It talks about enjambment, end stops, you talk about rhyme schemes and rhythms, and use all sorts of things that a poet writing would sort of know. And so what I appreciated is, but yet it's really accessible and easy to receive, and also very personal. So I have been reading, Ed's prose about poetry for pretty much when I was a baby poet, when I first started. And that's sort of partially how I was educated too. And so I just appreciated being a part of this. And I don't know all of these poems. And so I feel like I can't wait to kind of read every single poem, and then also read Ed thinking about the poems too, because I think that is an education for not only a writer, but for anyone, because it's written in a way that anyone can understand it and appreciate the poems. And so it's an honor, because again, so many of these books that you've written, I think, have really shaped me as a writer myself. So thank you for the work you do. I can't think of anyone else who does it quite as well as you do.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, when Ed wrote to me and said he wanted to include this poem, and he asked me some questions about it, I thought, well, it's going to be an anthology of poems. And when I got the book, I just saw what a monument it had become, and I was going, my God, that the kind of enthusiasm and the energy and the sheer love of poetry that it would take to, spend the time with all of these poems and think about what they're doing and try to relate their rhetorical gestures to their emotional ones and somehow find a harmonic whole to all of that, in these quite substantial essays, I mean, really 100 examples of close reading. Based on, I mean, I guess what is, a substantial career now as a reader of poems and a writer of poems and a writer about poems. So, I was just going, man, where does this guy find the time to do all this? It's just like,
yeah, no, I was thinking, I regularly
I
still
was
pull
very
out.
impressed.
Oh, are you, sorry, I'm not able to see you here. I regularly think about how to read a poem and fall in love with poetry. And that was super important to me when I first started writing poetry. And so this one reminds me of that book, but it's in smaller bite-sized sort of, pieces of prose. And I think that's what's going to be really great about reading. I think you get to read a lot more poems in quantity. And so I really can't wait to read it. And there's some of my favorite poems in here. I love W.S. Merwin's For the Anniversary of My Death. And I love Songs by Bridget Peason Kelly. I posted Nathan Hikmet's poem on Living on Twitter, and people really loved that. I love Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem, What Lips My Lips Have Kissed and Where and Why. So there's so many great poems in here, so I can't wait to read all the other ones that I'm not aware of too.
Well, Edward, we're so grateful for your readings of these poems and for gathering them together and for gathering all of us together tonight. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and remind you that the link is there in the chat if you'd like to get a copy of this for yourself or wander into the bookstore and explore that there. Anything anyone wants to add before we end for this evening?
Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, Victoria. It's so nice to see you.
Oh, it's so nice to see you. This is a huge accomplishment. Thank you so much.
Nice to be together. I appreciate your sensitivity. And the idea is really a book that's both for initiated and uninitiated readers. And that's what I appreciate about what Victoria and Vijay were saying. And that's that it's something for poets, yes. And hopefully we'll find recognition there, but it's also for uninitiated readers to sort of bring them into the tent to understand how these poems work as made things in human documents. So thank you, Jessica, for hosting us.
Thank you all so much for being here. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks
Thank
for coming.
you.